have access to sharing, so it must be,
No,
I
no,
don't
it
know.
was you.
Sorry.
It's fine. It's not an issue.
Um, so we had 12 people. Just hang on a sec for me. I'm echoing in the office next to me. We had 12 people that had RSVP'd, and I see that there's currently 11 online. So I think you can kick off, Iva, and then we will just admit people as they join in.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for joining me, and it's great to have you all. It's great to have you all on board again. Um, This is the SAPMA Human Resource Forum. We want to try and make sure that we keep within a 1 hour maximum limit every time we run these forums. So let's get started. On the agenda today, and you will have received an agenda from Warren. And just to indicate to you again, those of you who are not aware, Warren is our Yes intern. We have two Yes interns at SAPMA. Warren, raise your hand because there are two of you in the room. That's Warren. There you go. Warren is our Yes intern, and Warren is specifically responsible, amongst other things, for the management of our various forums. We have an HR forum, we've got an internal consultant forum, and we've got a retail and export forum. We've got quite a few forums. And Warren is the guy who, in fact, is the facilitator. So when you get emails from admin at SAPMA. That's Warren sitting right next to Tara. And the other Yes intern is Sean, and Sean is the guy who is our IT expert. He's working on our website, he's working on our databases, and he's working very closely with Khomotso in the office, who I'm sure you will all know. I just see there are three people in the waiting room, so I'm going to admit all three people. Okay, good. So again, welcome everybody to this HR forum. On the agenda today is personnel training and labor relations matters, and then current issues. You'll all know as HR practitioners that there are, in fact, those three legs to human resources. There are personnel issues to do with individual contracting, to do with job descriptions, to do with performance appraisals, etc., etc. There are training issues, and then there are labor relations issues, which have to do with counseling, have to do with discipline, CCMA, bargaining council, labor court issues, and also business unity South Africa, which is where we negotiate issues from SAPMA and the Surface Coating Employer Association outwardly. So I want to talk about personnel, training, labor relations, and then current issues, which are in fact raising their heads out there. So let's start. Let's start with our personnel update. Well, number one, you will all know that there is now a minimum wage which has been implemented as of the 1st of March. And essentially, the minimum wage is being increased by a CPI plus 1%, which is effectively going to bring your minimum wage up to roughly in the region of about 6,500 rand maximum, on average about 6,200 rand a month. The minimum wage in our sector, which is the coating sector, needs to be borne in mind by HR practitioners in our sector. And that means then that number one, if you're a party to the bargaining council, then your minimum wage is not 6,000 odd rand with the increase, because we run independently of any minimum wage or sectoral determination by the minister if you are a member of the bargaining council. In other words, if your company is a member of the Surface Coating Employer Association, and therefore through the Surface Coating Employer Association, you're a party to the bargaining council, your minimum wage then is not in the region of 6,000 Rand a month. Your minimum wage is in fact in the region of 10,500 Rand a month, because that is the minimum wage in the bargaining council, and it goes up roughly about 6.5% a year. We're currently on a 2-year agreement. So you need to understand that. The second thing you need to understand is that in some of your companies, some of your staff members are on a minimum wage for the sectoral agreement, and some of your staff members are in fact not party to the sectoral agreement. And in that particular regard, then the national minimum wage is effective, or if they're management, then in fact your contracted wages or your contracted salaries are effective. So it could be that in your company you run two different remuneration systems, the one relating to the a sectoral agreement for industrial chemicals, which is the bargaining council, and then for those people who fall outside of the scope of the bargaining council for whatever reason, the national minimum wage would apply. Um, you will have seen that we are now in the world of sectoral targets. The sectoral targets are not negotiated any longer. They've been imposed by the Minister of Employment and Labor. And those sectoral targets are now the targets which guide your workplace between 2025 and 2030. And this is the important thing to say to you, that you now have a 5-year period from the 1st of March, essentially, um, until the end of the 5 years in 2030, which is the end of February in 2030. And within that period, you have to have fully implemented the sectoral targets, which may change over time because the Department of Employment and Labor have said that they reserve the right to amend those sectoral targets from time to time. It's highly unlikely that those sectoral targets will be reduced. It's more than likely that those sectoral targets will be amended upwards, or just left alone. And when I say all just left alone, we have to bear in mind that those sectoral targets are very prohibitive. I mean, if you look at the sectoral targets for manufacturing, you look at the sectoral targets for retail, then you know what prohibitive means. And we have sent those sectoral targets out to you previously, and they will also be put on our website under resources for the HR forum. But the sectoral targets are very prohibitive for many companies, where the Minister of Employment and Labor is saying, we've spent the last 25 years imploring you to um, impl sorry, there's someone whose microphone is on. Won't you just please put it off? We've spent the last 5 year or last 25 years imploring business to come to the table, give us feedback, etc., etc. Very little of that has happened, according to the Ministry of Labor. And therefore, they're implementing these sectoral targets because they've engaged with some companies in the industries where they're implementing those sectoral targets for. Um, we are, and when I say we, I'm saying Tara and myself and other people within SAPMA sit on Business Unity South Africa, and we also sit at NEDLAC. And so we are completely, or rather regularly, trying to put pressure on the powers that be, which is government essentially, and organized labor, to go back to the drawing board on some of those sectoral targets because they are quite prohibitive. But nevertheless, those are the targets we have to live with. And we will, keep a very close eye as they change to inform you timeously of any changes. What we're also wanting to do is run a specific workshop on how you should be using the sectoral targets and planning for the sectoral targets in your transformation committees. Because your transformation committee is a combination of your employment equity planning on the one hand and of your workplace skills planning on the other hand. And they have to come together and they have to be reflected in your employment equity reports and your workplace skills planning report. But you have to now be making reference to sectoral targets. So I do implore you to do so. There is a series of tools we've created around the sectoral targets. The documents are being sent out on a regular basis. I'm also making a video on how to implement those sectoral targets in your transformation planning forums. But please do not take it for granted. in 2030. That's the date that's now being set. You know, I've been talking for a couple of years about the fact that there are compliance certificates which are being issued by the Department of Employment and Labor. They've now linked the compliance certificates to your implementing your employment equity targets, and the date for the compliance certificates have been set in 2030. It seems 5 years away, a long time away. But if you don't start planning now to implement your employment equity targets in your workplace over a 5 year period, you will be slapped in 2030 with no certificate of trading. And that will affect everything in your business. So please, you need to be aware of that now. Now, you don't have to automatically implement every single sectoral target or employment equity target, but you do have to have a reflection of the targets, a reflection of your workplace, and a cogent reason not to be implementing in specific areas. So I do want to point out to you, it is requiring activity now for those companies that employ more than 50 people. In other words, designated employers. Um, so those sectoral targets relate to designated employers, but the jury is still out, and I do need to emphasize this. The jury is still out on whether the Department of Employment and Labor are going to say for all businesses. So even if you employ 10 people and you have two managers in a 10 people company, one of them has to be from a designated black group, and then there also has to be gender reflected. So please, it does get complicated, but you can understand the political argument. The political argument is this is what our country looks like in terms of demographics. This is what a workplace looks like in terms of demographics. If the workplace doesn't reflect the country to some extent, and the minister's not saying these targets have to be implemented 100%, but there has to be a reason and a reflection. And it has to be a reason and reflection indicated in your reporting. So please, I cannot overemphasize that this is the Trojan horse upon which interference in the way you run your business can be engineered if we don't manage it properly. More important than the employment equity targets is this thing called the is the economically active profile, the EAP. Now, when the minister released the employment equity targets, he also released the economically active population profile for South Africa, based on 2023 Stats SA figures. And you will see there a reflection that the economically active, those people who are capable of working, those people who are actively seeking out work in the country, roughly looking something like this: 80% African, male and female. Roughly about 7% white, male and female. Roughly about 4.5% colored, male and female, and roughly about 1.6% Indian, male and female. That's your economically active population of South Africa, the profile of that active population, which was launched in 2023. So I'm going to say again, roughly about 80% African male and female, roughly about 7% white male and female, roughly about, let's make it 5% colored, and roughly about 1.6% Indian. You'll see this, the numbers I'm giving you are not the actual numbers. We have sent out the economically active profile documentation. I've also prepared a video on the on how you're supposed to read that economically active profile. What you've got to know now is that your planning on implementing the employment equity targets in your transformation committee activities, either in the industry as a whole for small businesses, in the sector as a whole for small businesses, or in-house in companies, is not just based on you meeting your employment equity targets, but you measuring your existing employment profile against the EAP. Now, where that becomes very important and very interesting is in this notion of the sunset clause. In 2000, when triple BE was first introduced and employment equity planning was first introduced, white women were included in the designation classification. In other words, essentially, white women were considered to be black between 2000 and 2010. That's because, in other words, alongside Indian, colored, and African, and disabled. So in 2000, it was disabled, it was Indian, it was colored, it was African, and it was white women. Those were considered to be the designated groups, the groups that NEDLAC and Parliament wanted to focus on in getting to the boardroom table, in getting into management positions in the workplace. And by the way, it's in management, in junior, in middle, in senior, and in executive management that the only real yardstick of change, employment equity change in the workplace, is currently measured our management. So we look at the whole profile of the company from an employment equity point of view, but in terms of the measurement of targets, those employment equity targets relate to who's in control of the business in terms of junior, middle, senior, and executive management levels. And that's reflected in employment equity. It's also reflected, as you know, in triple BE planning in the workplace. So between 2000 and 2010, the designated categories who should benefit from employment equity were the disabled community, white women, and then Indian, colored, and African individuals. In 2010, the definition of designated groups who should benefit from employment equity and triple BE was changed. They took out disabled white people and they took out white women. So it became then exclusively disability of Indian, colored, or African, Indian male and female, colored male and female, and African male and female, and Chinese people naturalized before 1994. And that hasn't changed now. That's currently the designated group of beneficiaries of employment equity and triple BEE. Except when the minister released the economically active population profile for 2023 in January this year, when he released it together with the employment equity targets, he made the following statement. He said that oversubscribed designated groups, so Indian, colored, African, disabled, Indian, colored, African, and Chinese people naturalized before 1994 are the designated groups at the moment. Oversubscribed designated populations relating to the economically active population profile, the EAP, oversubscription of any designated a community in that list of designated groups must result in your workplace in a moratorium, in a freeze of employment between now and 2030 until such time as you have corrected any gaps in your company meeting the EAP profile. Now, this is huge. It's huge because the real statistics against the EAP profile, and I'm not talking now, this is the minister talking, was that whereas, and we're talking at management levels, so junior, middle, senior, and executive management levels, the minister made this comment that if you look at the economically active profile and then you look at the employment equity report from the Department of Labor, you will see there that colored and Indian, male and female managers at junior, middle, senior, and executive within companies were oversubscribed on average by between 5 and 800%. That means that instead of 1.6% of your workforce being Indian male, for example, and I'm not picking on any particular group, I'm quoting from the EAP report the minister released, 1.6% of your workforce should be of your managers in your workforce, junior, middle, senior, and executive, should be Indian males. The minister has determined that on average across those four levels, there is 13% of junior, middle, senior, and executive managers who in fact are Indian males. So not 1.6%, but 13%. That's oversubscription. Similarly for females, similarly for within the colored community, but not to that extent. Now, so what that means is that the Indian and the colored grouping of managers in junior, middle, senior, and executive level are massively oversubscribed at the cost or to the detriment of African males and females, where the targets should be 80%, but the employment equity targets are about 50% at junior, middle, senior, and executive management levels. But the real numbers are in the region of about 30% because of the oversubscription in the other designated groups. And again, this is not me, I'm the messenger here. But what I am saying is the instruction is it cannot be like that in 2030. So you've got 5 years not to do anything, not to get rid of your white managers who at the moment are massively oversubscribed in all of those in the executive and senior categories, but not the junior and the middle management categories. Your Indian and your colored male and females who are oversubscribed in all of those levels. The object of the exercise is not to get rid of those individuals. You can't legally, morally, conscionably. And companies don't want to because there's a reason those people are in their jobs as far as the recruitment and the HR and the CEOs of those businesses are concerned because they're doing the job. So the object of the exercise is not to affect their employment status, but to make sure that as you recruit and move more people going forward into junior, middle, senior, and executive management levels, board levels, that those people cannot be, additional people cannot be recruited from the white community, from the Indian community, from the colored community. They have to be balancing male and female African people in those management positions moving forward. That is what the Department of Employment and Labor are saying. And you've got 5 years to correct that imbalance. Now, the reality is the white population is dwindling, it's diminishing, it's dying off, it's becoming less and less significant in those population numbers. And through a process of natural attrition, which is retirement, which is death, you're going to have less and less of a problem with that component of your junior, middle, senior, and executive managers. But you have to create a freeze and a sunset clause on recruitment of people who are Indian or colored into those positions until you can show that you've effected real change within the African community of the people you're recruiting into those management positions, junior, middle, senior, executive. Again, do not shoot the messenger. I am bringing you the message of what your focus needs to be in your transformation committee activity, which is a combination of employment equity and workplace skills planning and your triple BE activities. Before I carry on, are there any questions in that regard? Because I know I'm getting some of you very angry, but I'm addressing it because it has to be addressed. Anybody want to ask a question or make a statement?
Yes, Ivor. Just
If they,
look, I understand all this, and I am not against what's happening because I do agree that they should address the past, okay, and fix that up. That's what I believe. But you get countries outside of South Africa, in Europe and America, where there are families running a business, and the families are shareholders, and they trying to work their kids into coming and taking over the business. Now, it becomes a bit of a problem there because how do you bring those kids into your business when you want to hold this business as a family business, when you've got to actually bring in other people in as owners of the business?
So, Aggie, it is obviously a challenge for family-run businesses. Family-run businesses are on the agenda of BUSA that are raising it with through NEDLAC, with policymakers, particularly in Parliament. The counter argument, and again, this is not my counter argument, because
Yeah.
you and I can chat offline if you want about some of the solutions in that regard. But the counter argument is this, that for a company to benefit from local, provincial, national government business, or for a company to supply other companies that are benefiting from local, provincial, national business, there is no consideration. There's nothing factored into triple BE legislation which would indicate that a family-run business should, can, or would be treated in any other way to any other normal business out there. So it does create a real problem for family-owned businesses. There are multiple solutions as long as you're mindful and active in planning now and dealing with the economically active population profile and your employment equity targets and planning now to address it and do something. A little later in my presentation, I'm going to be addressing the issue of management development program that we're considering within SAPMA for our member companies. But that's one of the ways to deal with you not wanting to affect your current composition of your management structure at some levels, cannot be all levels, at some level, but at the same time meeting the requirements from the Department of Employment and Labor. There are multiple ways of tackling and dealing with it, but thank you for that. That's a very important consideration. I will, by the way, raise it with my BUSA colleagues again to make sure that it becomes that it's not overlooked, it's not forgotten.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Tara, I can't see raised hands because I'm sharing my screen, but if you can, if there's someone wants to talk, please, won't you just remind me of that? All right, so I'm going to move on. So that's called the sunset clause, by the way, that with white, Indian, colored individuals, and unfortunately white disabled individuals, the sun has set on them being able to be classified as designated groups in terms of employment equity and in terms of triple BEE. The sun has set on that. The benefit for those groups has to be frozen. No action can, should, would, must be taken against white, Indian, colored people in their current positions in their companies. But they cannot be promoted beyond their existing levels, and new white, Indian, and colored males and females cannot be recruited into your company if your company's EAP profile doesn't match the 2023 EAP profile. Now, there are some companies that say, well, I'll take my chances until 2030, which is fair enough. But the Department of Employment and Labor is saying we're going to inspect companies from 2026 to make sure that there is mindfulness and consideration of the EAP and the employment equity targets year on year on year towards 2030, rather than us, the Department of Employment and Labor, being caught off guard or by surprise in 2030 with the real levels of transformation. So be aware of the sunset clause and just understand it. Okay. So one of the things we are planning to do in the course of this year and next year is the implementation of a number of YES programs. Now, YES is where we take individuals who already have a qualification but are unemployed, and we put them in either as a company, we simply bring them into the company as additional headcount, additional employees, or we do SAPMA runs a program and in fact, we intend to run a number of YES programs, where in fact we try and lessen the load of applying individuals in clever positions, in clever systematic ways in your company to make sure you benefit both from YES, which allows you to improve your triple BE status by 2 years, by 2 levels. But at the same time, the contribution they make in the workplace is a set programmatic contribution on behalf of the company. So one of those YES programs is going to be the triple BE facilitator program. Someone who is in your company is seconded either to an HR person or an HR department. And besides everybody else in those departments, that individual will be responsible for triple BE facilitation. And normally there are 5 elements which apply. So working with HR and moderated through a central SAPMA program of activities in the course of the year. So by the end of the year, they've done all 5 elements. There are reports on the 5 elements. Those reports have been supervised in terms of the triple BE rules and regulations in the country. Everyone benefits. I'm sounding like very Mark, but everyone benefits, including, by the way, facilitation or at least secretarial and administrative activity within your transformation committees within your businesses. So a programmatic development of YES interns within your workplace, in the sector as a whole, or dedicated within your workplace is something that we're focusing on within SAPMA. Just in terms of personnel, there are 2 policy framework considerations you need to be considering at this moment in time. The one is that you have to have in a country which is in a company which is a designated employer, in other words, employs more than 50 people, you have to have a standardized and registered whistleblowing policy within your business. And you will have noticed on the SAPMA website that we now have a relationship with a whistleblowing facilitating business where you can register, you can adopt the code of ethics, you can adopt the policy framework if you don't want to develop your own policy framework within your business. So just put that at the back of your mind as something you have to do over time, have a whistleblowing policy a framework within your company. And the other is you have to have a consumer goods ombudsman policy framework as well, because you have to protect your company against the excesses and exigencies of your staff members who might be walking on the wild side of the Consumer Goods and the Consumer Protection Act. So you will have heard we have an MOU with the Office for Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman, because every single company which is customer facing, which is business to consumer, every single one of those companies has to be registered with the Office for Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman, has to pay a registration fee. It's not a lot. It's like 1,000 Rand for an average size company a year with the Office for Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman. And therefore, if there is a Hello Peter or a Google complaint about you, or a consumer who says, I've got a problem with a tin of paint and the company's not honoring the guarantee or the contractor's not honoring the warranty, they go to the Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman. The Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman has an agreement with SAPMA that anything to do with paints and coatings will come to SAPMA to resolve in terms of our mediation process. And only if we can't resolve it between the supplier of the paint, which is the retailer, and the manufacturer, by the way, and I've spoken about this many times over the last years, but they're liable for the guarantee on the paint, even if it was a contractor problem. I just need to emphasize that. But we want to be dealing with it within our tent, within our home of coatings. We don't want some arbitrary mediator from the Office for the Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman to deal with it until we've not managed to resolve the problem, and then it goes back to the Office for the Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman. So we've sent out quite a bit of documentation on that MOU we have and what your responsibility is as a retailer or a consumer-facing company. But we'll continue to do it. We'll run workshops on it, and we'll also suggest policy frameworks, the simplest kind of policy frameworks in your business. But you need to be mindful about the need to develop those two policy frameworks. Just before I carry on now to training, any final questions about anything I've dealt with on personnel? Tara, from your point of view, no hands on your side, hey?
No hands at the moment, thank you.
Okay. So now we get to the less contentious stuff, and that's training and development. So you will have all heard, or you will know by now as HR practitioners, that when it comes to training, SAPMA, South African Qualifications Authority, have said we are taking the focus away from SETAs in terms of the registration of learning programs and the accreditation of training providers. And we, SAQA, have created a new body called it's not that new, it's 10 years old, but a new body called the Qualification Council for Trade and Occupations, where they're focusing specifically on occupational qualifications, occupational learnerships, skills programs, etc., etc. And where training providers now have to come to the QCTO rather than to a SETA for accreditation of those programs. And so the big debate at the moment is about how much being accredited by the QCTO is going to cost. And those of you who are trainers or training providers or who are engaging with your company's training providers will know that the QCTO, as of the beginning of January, have been on a roadshow where they've been unveiling their tariffs for the accreditation of training programs. So there's an entire tariff scheme that says your first training program is going to cost 6,000 Rand. Your next training program is going to cost, I think, 2,500 Rand, up to 5 training programs, and then the 6,000 starts again. So there is a cost to a training provider being accredited on the National Qualification Framework under the auspices of the Qualification Council for Trade and Occupations. The cost at the moment is being projected to be recovered by the QCTO via a tariff charge. However, and now I talk as someone who sits at NEDLAC for BUSA on these issues. NEDLAC is currently debating a proposal from the Department of Employment and Labor that says that SETAs will have to contribute 1% of the money it receives from companies as a skills levy to QCTO. So the QCTO will end up now with two sources of income. The one is the tariffs they're charging training providers for accreditation, and the other is a 1% transfer of money that a SETA receives to the QCTO for its budget. So we're currently fighting that at NEDLAC as BUSA because we're saying that's double dipping. If 1% of all skills levies collected goes to the QCTO, there is no need also for the QCTO to charge training providers a tariff schedule for accreditation of their training programs. That's double dipping. So I just wanted to give you a taste of the deliciousness of the political debate around the QCTO, because what we're trying to do is reduce the amount of money that training providers are going to have to fork out to become accredited for their training programs. Because training providers are screaming from the rooftops about these expenses and these costs in the tariffs. Although logic says this, if I'm going to make money out of training, surely the cost of accreditation is my investment in my product. But that's not the way training providers see it. They've been so used to, over the last 20 years, getting everything for free in terms of accreditation that they are screaming from the rooftops about the tariffs that the QCTO wants to levy against training providers who want to be accredited. And so I think the problem is less with the QCTO than it is with training providers and the training provider network. But that will have to sort itself out. So the second point I wanted to bring up with you about, and so when your training provider turns around to you and says, last point on this, when your training provider turns around to you and says, we're going to have to increase the cost of training because we're now having to pay for accreditation, your answer should be, I don't increase the cost of my product because I have to invest in a manufacturing plant. I have to invest in product design, in labels. That's the cost of manufacturing. So my existing price absorbs the cost of manufacturing. But training providers are not sophisticated enough. They really are not. It's like a sheltered industry. They are not sophisticated enough to understand they have to bear the cost of accreditation. And we will not allow, SAPMA will not allow an inflation in the cost of training because your training providers now have to pay for accreditation. They should have been paying for it over the last 20 years, but it's been funded by CETAs. It's been funded out of your skills levy. Now they're being asked to pay to play. And so always bear that in mind when you engage with your training providers. Kick back on any inflationary increases that they want to implement where they're saying, well, now we have to pay for accreditation. They should have been paying for that for the last 25 years. So the second point on training update is about legacy qualifications and learnerships. And just to remind you, colleagues, that qualifications, the old qualifications on the NQF have been being phased out over the last 3 years. And each year they've extended the life of those qualifications because the QCTO hasn't got its act together in terms of accreditation of sufficient replacements. But the point is, we are now on the last legs of legacy qualifications. Only roughly about 220 were extended last year until this year, July. It's highly unlikely that there will be an additional extension of the legacy qualifications, although I have a slight suspicion that they will be extended only because the QCTO still doesn't have its house together in terms of the accreditation of new qualifications. But what you have to bear in mind is, where that qualification was a 120 credit qualification as a legacy qualification, the entire occupational skills framework has now been hijacked by academics. And those academics have converted occupational training into academic training. If you look at the majority of the new qualifications and learnerships being registered by the QCTO. And so a 120 credit qualification where the training provider and the workplace were doing assessment on that qualification in real time during a learnership or during a training program has now been taken away from the provider, has now been taken away from the workplace, and an entire industry has been created by the QCTO where the QCTO will do assessments on qualifications and learnerships and hand that work out to their buddies essentially, and cut the workplace out in the assessment process. So we're fighting this as BUSA and at NEDLAC because it's not why the qualification framework was first created, and it's certainly not why learnerships were created. But if you were to say to me, in my training plan for my company, should I be factoring learnerships in, which take 120 one-year qualification and make it a 242-year qualification because of the new academic content, I would say to you, you're smoking something very bad for you. I would not touch modern learnerships, in other words, QCTO accredited learnerships, until this entire debacle, fiasco, has settled down and you in your workplace are in control of those learnerships, because the learnership is only there to help you achieve your triple BE status. Otherwise, you could be having internships, apprenticeships if you wanted, or in fact, YES programs. So I would say to you, in your planning process for triple BE, move away, sacrifice your 8 out of 25 points for learnerships and your couple of bonus points for conversion from learnerships into permanent employment, unless you desperately want those modern learnerships, and rather focus on yes opportunities. Because a yes opportunity says that if there is a job of work to be done in your company, you want to have a group of people in addition to your existing headcount coming in because there is triple BE benefit. Use yes rather than learnerships. Means you don't have to deal with training providers. Means it's not a situation where at least 30% of your workplace is taken up by these learners leaving your workplace to be trained, etc., etc. Rather say this to yourself. Take qualified people who have qualifications that you want, bring them into a 12-month fixed term contract of employment as a yes person, and put them to work rather than expect that it's a training program. But that's just me talking. From a triple BE perspective, you might have a completely different strategy in your workplace about why you want to utilize learnerships. But I do need to caution that the modern learnership is a 2-year learnership, minimum 240 credits. And that's what you get your 12H benefit from. And at the moment, it's a double benefit. So you can get per year your 80,000 tax deduction. So about 28% of that 80,000 is your real win. And you can spread it over 2 years, or rather you can take it over 2 years. So it becomes 160,000 over a 2-year fixed term contract of employment for a 240 credit learnership. So there are pros and there are cons, but you need to be mindful of the pros and cons and make a strategic decision in your transformation committee activities where you're doing employment equity and workplace skills planning. Before I move on, any questions in that regard? Any comments? Nothing. Phew. So you're just accepting what I'm saying. Okay, thank you for that. I'm very happy, by the way, to make presentations to your transformation committees if they need to delve into any of the details I'm handling in this presentation. So my advice to you is in the short term, shift to yes programs rather than learnership programs for your business. Now, here's the next interesting thing. The Skills Development Funding Act is currently being renegotiated at NEDLAC. And it's exciting. I sit there and government and labor want one thing and business want another thing. But at the moment, what's on the table presented by the Department of Employment and Labor is a reduction in your mandatory grant entitlement. So just to remind you, when this started out in 2000, for every 1% of payroll you were paying as a skills levy, you were entitled to 50% of your payment back. And that was whittled down over the last 24 years to now 30%. And it's being whittled down even further. And that's what's currently under negotiation. What the Department of Labor want to see is that your mandatory grant entitlement is whittled down to 20%. But they also want to introduce an additional 15% for what is referred to as work integrated learning. So if you engage in work integrated learning, which is where you take someone who's studying HR and you bring them into the workplace for a couple of months or for vacation work, etc., job shadowing and a little bit of contribution in your workplace, you're entitled to a 15% mandatory grant claim according to the Department of Labor. Business is saying we don't want a work integrated learning because that's paying to do the work of the Department of Labor and Department of Education. And now you're passing the buck onto the workplace with a carrot that says if the workplace does it, the workplace can get 15% of its mandatory grant back. So that's currently up in the air. It is very likely that the Department of Labor and the trade unions will win this one over time, but not at the percentages that's currently being suggested. And the reason that the trade unions want to win this one is that within the mandatory grant system, the trade unions want a grant created within the CETA for worker education, shop steward education. And they're looking to get a bigger grant back from the SETA, from your skills levy, for shop steward education, then as a company, you're entitled to get back from the SETA for your mandatory grant. So that's the politics of why the trade unions are so in favor of what the Department of Labor are proposing. That your mandatory grant gets whittled down, your real mandatory grant gets whittled down, and instead you're being incentivized to do the work of the Department of Education in the workplace. So that's a debate at NEDLAC you need to be aware of. It's not early days, by the way. The fait accompli and the ultimatum was presented at our last NEDLAC meeting last week by the Department of Higher Education and Training and Department of Labor. But we've rejected it as business because we do not want to see your entitlement as business diminished in favor of you funding what should be fiscally funded out of the tax base in Department of Education or Higher Education and Training, and in fact funding worker education for the trade unions. So that's the fun and games at NEDLAC. But what SAPMA is saying is this, that work integration learning is important enough for us to look at some stage at having a training facilitator for your workplace who also focuses on work integrated learning, especially if it becomes a change in the mandatory grant entitlement. So we're looking at that, but certainly nothing to talk about here, move on kind of thing at this moment in time. Before I move off of training, any questions anybody has for me or any points anyone wants to make? Guys, you are extremely quiet. I hope you're all still there. Tara, is everyone still there?
We have 16 participants. So yes, everybody is still. I think 2 people have dropped off, but at the moment we've got 16.
Okay.
I think it's just more information overload at this stage. So I think
I know.
we'll have to just send a lot of follow-up documentation from this.
All right. Look, guys, unfortunately, and I know we've been peppering you with documentation, etc. All of the stuff we send out will be on our website under the HR Forum Resources tab. But you're required to read these things as HR practitioners. You're required to give feedback or implement in the workplace as HR practitioners. So unfortunately, you can't duck that responsibility. So now we're talking about the professional body update under training. And so there is a designation component and then a CPD component of what I want to say. We've currently implemented the senior executive leader where we finished our pilot. We've got 13 individuals who've been designated as senior executive leaders, and they are now moving into continuous professional development over a 3-year period to re-register as senior executive leaders. For strategic reasons, our next designation will be the professional retail mixologist designation for retailers. So the person who does tinting, the person who does mixing in your retail environment is someone we want to become that retail mixologist. It's really just consolidating any tinting and mixology training they've received from the suppliers of equipment and machinery, recognizing them as professional mixologists. And we have to do that to satisfy the Office for the Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman, who is saying that if a retailer doesn't have someone who's been trained to tint and something goes wrong with the product, the retailer becomes liable for the product rather than the manufacturer. On the one hand. On the other hand, manufacturers are saying that the moment a white tin of paint is opened within a retail environment and they start playing with a tinting machine, it invalidates our guarantee. Not all manufacturers obviously are saying that, but it is general sentiment. Why should we guarantee a product when that product is interfered with by people who haven't been trained and aren't recognized as tinters or mixologists in the retail environment? So for those 2 reasons, number one, the fact that the Office for the Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman saying that a retailer assumes accountability for guarantee on a paint product if the people working with that paint product in terms of value adding, beneficiation, tinting, mixology, etc., are not trained and are not recognized as professional. And the second reason is that paint manufacturers are saying that the moment you open a tin of our paint and you start tinting it and mixing it, because there is no standard currently for the people doing the work on the mixing and the tinting, it invalidates our guarantee. And that leaves the consumer high and dry, because the Office for the Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman is saying, well, then who's accountable for that product? Is it the retailer or the manufacturer? Actually, the Consumer Protection Act says both, by the way. There is joint responsibility for a defective product, and that responsibility is equally shared between the retailer and the manufacturer. So in introducing the professional retail mixologist designation as a priority area now for at least the next couple of months, we are looking to retailers to identify their mixologists, their paint tinters, and to submit them to us for professional recognition, not for training and development, for professional recognition. If we find that there is a gap in terms of training and development, we will address that gap with the suppliers of the machinery and equipment. But it is something that everybody needs to be aware of. The other designations we're looking at is professional paint chemist, because there is no professional recognition of paint chemists in South Africa, and the paint chemist support practitioner, the people who work within a research and development or a manufacturing division as the paint chemistry department, but they're not the paint chemists. So in the course of 2025, those are the three designations we're looking to roll out: mixologist, paint chemist, and support practitioner. Along the way, there will be new designations, undoubtedly. And just to tell you then that the moment we recognize somebody within any of these categories, and they can put those labels behind their name, SEL, PRM, PPC, or PCSP, the continuous professional development requirement kicks in that over a 3-year period, they participate in machinery manufacturer updates, training, tinting training, color chart training, etc., so that by the time they want to re-register for their designations, they've actually participated in training and development of some kind that is recognized within the coating sector. So that's the game that we're currently playing within the professional body. Any comments about that before I move on? Okay, moving on. So I have alluded to the fact that from a SAPMA point of view, we want to be affirmative in creating opportunities for our member companies, especially the smaller companies, but equally the larger companies, to benefit from orchestrated, programmed internships. Yes, internships, where we're able to take someone who has a qualification but is unemployed. If you've got one position available in your workplace, we'll give you 2 people to choose from or 3 people to choose from. But to move those individuals into, yes, internship opportunities on a programmed basis. And we're not going to manage that within SAPMA. We're going to do it by entering into a relationship with external suppliers of graduates, where those graduates are managed through the 12-month YES program in such a way that there is, I call them work chunks. If a person is an HR practitioner and they're moving into personnel, they should be able to do job descriptions. They should be able to do performance appraisals. They should be able to design a grading system. They should be able to do feedback sessions, counseling sessions, etc., etc. And so those become the work chunks or the outputs of people who've graduated with the qualification that we're going to drive them through centrally within SAPMA, within your workplace or for your workplace. So that by the end of that 12-month period, you've actually got policy-based and practice-based intellectual property that's been developed for your company by these people who you are allowing to come onto YES programs for in your company. And these are just some of those YES program opportunities. So I'll start at the bottom. I've already mentioned work integrated learning facilitation. Obviously, a labor relations facilitator is critically important, particularly for those of you who've got multiple sites around the country and feel you need a labor relations handle or representative in those multiple sites. Your triple BE facilitator is crucially strategic. And we'll move those people through the 5 elements, through putting together your a vault of documentation for submission for verification, whoever does your internal verification or external verification. But we'll move those 5 elements through with you from beginning to end if you haven't started. And if you have started, we'll be able to moderate the quality of the work being done in your company in that regard. Then something very specific, which is graphic design and social media practitioners in a YES internship. And remember that there are 2 advantages of YES. The first advantage is that you get the person at minimum wage for that 12-month period, and that shouldn't be an incentive, but because it's an increase in headcount, it's always a consideration. But there is equally an ETI offset of 1,500 Rand a month per person. So it's below what is the industry's minimum wage or the minimum wage from the Department of Labor. But the main advantage is that if you meet your YES headcount target, you can actually skip to triple BE levels. So if you're a level 4, you can get to a 2. If you're a 3, you can get to a 1. So it has a major advantage if you're meeting your headcount target in that regard. Supply chain officers, we want eventually to see designated employers. In other words, employers who have to do triple BE. We want to see you having a YES person in your supply chain division who is responsible for the triple BE compliance in terms of procurement, enterprise development, supplier development, alongside the people already working in your department in that regard. Because we can control or we can direct and guide that what they're doing is precisely what needs to be done for the verification activity of your business so that it becomes a measured entity. Project management officers have been pointed out by some of the companies as a need. And then management development. Now, management development is really a sexy YES opportunity because if you have, for example, the old Woolworths training program for managers, it was spread over 2 years. People got rotated through various departments. And so they really were properly inducted into management in the company. Well, imagine you do the same thing, a 2-year management development program facilitated by SAPMA, where someone has an opportunity either to stay within junior, middle, or senior management, serving a junior, middle, senior management individual, or be rotated in some way or another within your company. What that does is it enhances your profile, your employment profile, your employment equity report, because that person is seconded to that middle or senior or executive manager, and therefore counts towards that band of points on the triple BE scorecard. It is really a very, very sexy opportunity to pursue in your workplace if you understand the machinery and the mechanics of it. Okay, any questions about YES? And what we're trying to do is make sure that if you participate in the YES program opportunity, that it doesn't cost you anything more than registration with YES and the salary or the stipend you have to pay the YES beneficiary. In other words, that there is no cost for the facilitation of the annual program. That's ideally where we're trying to get with our negotiation with some of the providers out there. I just want to...
I don't have a question on the YES program. I just need to remind you to be mindful of time because the meeting was due to end at 10 o'clock and it's 5 past.
All right, let me rush. Our labor relations update. Well, you know about our wage agreement. You know that it's a 2-year agreement. So for industrial chemical, there's no negotiation this year on wages, but there is ongoing conditions of employment negotiation. There is also at the NBCCI negotiation around Rule 25 and Rule 31. Rule 25 and Rule 31 determine whether or not you have to have a lawyer representing you in arbitration activities at the bargaining council. Employers are saying that it shouldn't be that you have to always have a lawyer representing you or you have to belong to an employer association. That in fact, you should also be entitled to use your labor relations consultants who are more than capable of representing you in those arbitration activities. That's currently a debate happening at the National Bargaining Council for the chemical industry. Number two, within the National Bargaining Council for the chemical industry, there are different chambers, one of which is glass, the other is industrial chemicals. We're industrial chemicals. But just to tell you that the glass sectoral agreement was this year extended to cover non-parties. We've been warning about the fact that again and again and again, that eventually the entire bargaining council's sectoral agreements will be extended to cover non-parties. The next chamber on the bargaining council's target is industrial chemicals. Now, obviously, SAPMA and the Surface Coating Employer Association will have a lot to say about whether extension can be allowed to happen. We don't think it should be allowed to happen. But if the minister finds that within the Surface Coating Employer Association, there are in excess of 40% of employees who work for the companies who are members of the Surface Coating Employer Association, the minister will extend the sectoral agreement that currently is voluntary to cover all SAPMA members. And we've been warning about this for some time, but the warning is really, is your house in order if there is an extension? In other words, where are you on minimum wages in your company? Where are you on conditions of employment in your company? Because if you're nowhere, you need to be somewhere. You need to be mindful of the fact that whether it's this year, next year, or the year after, there will be an extension of this agreement. And we want to make sure that you're not caught sitting as a sitting duck would be. So be aware of the extension debate around industrial chemicals. Third thing in labor relations is we have a labor relations bulletin. You'll see we're peppering you with relevant labor court precedent or CCMA precedent where decisions have been made about how the laws and the regulations around labor relations should be interpreted. But please always be aware, try read the extracts, try read the summaries of what we're sending you. And we will have a labor bulletin on our website under the HR forum, where in fact, in that labor bulletin, you will be able to see summaries and an index of the most recent labor relations decisions, whether it's at the CCMA, the Bargaining Council, or in fact, the Labor Court. So just be aware of that. Current issues. Well, you will have heard that the UIF have this fund available where companies have to engage in Section 189, in other words, retrenchments, and they want to cushion the blow on employees who may be retrenched. A perfect example came up in another forum the other day that I wanted to bring to your attention. So you'll know that all of your banks are closing their customer-facing offices and they're going online through a call center. Now, there's a perfect example of what the UIF fund is for, where Capitec says, we're about to retrench 100 tellers, and the UIF says, before you do that, let's give them call center training, because an experienced teller with call center training in the call center industry, in Capitec's call center, makes that person relevant. So they're not going to be made redundant any longer, but suddenly they have relevant skills because of their experience. Now, that's what the UIF funding is there for. And the conversion programming of, let's call them AI-affected support staff in your businesses, is something that as SAPMA we're going to take an interest in over the years to come and see if we can't manufacture and massage something with the UIF so that funding is available, so that you feel less guilty or there's less impact on your company when you have to retrench those staff because of the impact of artificial intelligence in the employment cycle in your businesses. So that's just to bring that to your attention. So when we ask you to participate in a forum, you'll know why we're asking you for that participation. Second point on current issues. You'll have seen that the bright spark Minister of Trade and Industry and Competition has come up with this notion that he wants to create 100 billion rand a year fund, 100 billion rand a year fund, where they can take the money out of the fund and they can give it to emerging and survivalist black businesses and larger black businesses in the country. Now that fund already exists. It exists in terms of enterprise and supplier development already in triple BEE. But what he's trying to do, and trust me, this will be something we counter at NEDLAC with every fiber of our body. But what he's trying to do is hijack the 3% of net profit after tax that a company should be spending on enterprise and supplier development, taking it into the National Empowerment Fund, which we know is corrupt as hell, and really running it as government's bank account. So just be aware that that's what that debate is about. The Department of Trade and Industry and Competition trying to capture enterprise and supplier development funds and to run it as their own little bank account. And obviously we're going to oppose it at NEDLAC and make sure that it doesn't happen. And the last point on the current issues is you might have seen a release by the Department of Employment and Labor of their work program that they've just announced, where they intend over the next year to employ and contract 20,000 inspectors for the Department of Labor. 20,000 inspectors to go out and to test for compliance in workplaces around the country. 20,000. And in fact, the criteria for who those people are in fact yes criteria. They have to have a qualification and they're given a badge, they're given entitlement, and they go out and they try to shake you guys down essentially. And so we're keeping a very wary eye on that. We need to know, SAPMA needs to know if you've been the subject of a shakedown in one way or another by Department of Labor inspectors. And we want you to try and take photographs, try and record who they are, ask them for their cards, take a photo of their card, and get that to us so we can monitor those activities because we know there's going to be abuse. This is the Department of Employment and Labor after all. This is government after all. And so we want you to be wary and skeptical, never agree to anything when you engage with those inspectors, unless you've got verification that what they're asking for is legitimate. And what they're trying to force you to do is equally legitimate. We know that one of the objectives for those inspectors is to get them to force employers to immediately apply the economically active population profile of 2023, rather than graduate the application over the next 5 years. We know that for a fact. So be very skeptical when someone pitches up from the Department of Labor and says, I'm here to inspect your workplace. There are things they are allowed to do, but there are many things they're not allowed to do. And it's only in conversation with SAPMA that we'll be able to advise you and determine about the trends that are happening by these inspectors in your workplaces. So colleagues, I'm sorry for having gone over the time, but as you can see, it's a massive program, this HR program. When we book out in the future, we're most probably going to have to book out an hour and a half rather than an hour. And I know, or run 2 different sessions, splitting, personnel training and industrial relations in some way or another. Any comments? And again, I do apologize for having gone over the time. Any comments, any queries, any observations? Mark, you've been particularly silent, and that makes me very worried.
I'm a bit gobsmacked by all the information, but as always, well covered. Yeah, lots of food for thought. I might, in any event, be engaging with you on some of these issues offline in any event. But
thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think well covered, and yeah, I think we've run out of time, and I'm pressed for another meeting myself. Otherwise, I do have a few questions. But a big thanks again to you. Some really, really valuable insight and your views on some of these things. So thanks some more, Ivor.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for coming. Thanks for going. Kulu, I see you've got your hand up, sir.
Yeah, just a quick one, Ivor.
Sorry, Kulu, I called you sir. I meant to say ma'am.
That's okay. Just a quick one on the training. When you were talking about the retail mixologist and the pain chemist, would that process be like an RPL kind of process?
Yeah, very much so. So in fact, it is a case of saying that it's absolutely an RPL process, but it's a case of actually saying that at the end of the day, we're not interested in the training. We're interested in the fact as a professional body that the person has received training, and we want to know who they received it from, even if it's internal, so that we can actually document that as part of the RPL process. But then we want to know the guy's been with you for 5 years. He's had a good performance appraisal each year. If there have been areas in need of attention, you've attended to those areas in need of attention, because we want to recognize him as a professional practitioner. The test is not so much in us recognizing him or her as a professional practitioner, but the test is the quality of their participation in ongoing CPD, continuous professional development, around their area. So if it's mixology, around tinting, etc., etc. And that's where we will work very closely with the suppliers of the machinery and equipment you have in your workplace for tinting and for mixing. And we'll make sure that they are our CPD providers on the ground. So nothing changes for you, but we're simply able to document it, so that every 3 years that individual is able to be re-registered, because they're being beneficiated over the 3-year period through continuous professional development. I hope I've answered your question.
You have. Thank you. And we would engage with Homotso to get that process going.
We will engage definitely with Homotso, and we will engage with subject matter experts to make sure that it's consistent and that it's supported the whole way through the process.
All right. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other questions?
Sorry, Ivor, can I just come in there?
Yes,
Clearly,
Tara.
you won't be dealing with Homotso. It will be with Warren and myself. So if you want to make contact with us with regards to that, then we'll help you with the professional body, because it falls under Warren as the intern and myself. So, and then Ivor will get involved also from the professional body overview as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's really what I was wanting to know. Who do I get in touch with? Thank you. I will do.
Perfect. Sure.
Okay, bye.
And then just one other comment that I've got, Ivor. I know that you had sent us a document to be sent out to the HR practitioners with regards to insights into how to deal with trade unions and shop stewards. We'll send that out as an addendum to the meeting with the recording that you've got and your presentation. And if anybody's got any feedback on that or any questions, they can always make contact with the SAPMA office as well.
Tara, I think I'm gonna do a podcast around that document. Colleagues, just to advise you. So I get questions all the time about the recognition of trade unions in your workplace, about the recognition and how far you have to go in relation to shop stewards. I get these questions all the time. And so what I did is I put a document together for you. To actually deal with those questions and provide some answers. In some of the answers, I refer to the LRA requirements or other legislative requirements. And I also refer to the precedents set in the Labour Court or the CCMA, which affect those questions and answer those questions. So it's quite a lengthy document. It's about 10 pages. But when you do get it, have a look through it, because it's really like your ABC of dealing with trade unions, especially if you haven't previously dealt with trade unions. And then also about how you deal with shop stewards, including, by the way, can a shop steward be subject to discipline? Can they be subject to your normal processes and mechanisms and systems in your business? And when can you dismiss and when can't you dismiss? In terms of what the Labour Court's saying and what the CCMA is saying in that regard. In terms of trade unions, if there's a majority trade union, can you be dealing with minority trade unions as well? What is a closed shop? What is an agency agreement, etc., etc.? So we're working through all of those. The document will become more and more refined over time, but I will do a podcast on some of the highlights from that document. It will also be as a tool on our website under the Human Resource tab or Human Resource Forum tab, because it will change as we have new precedents coming out in answer to those questions. So we'll update that document with all the new precedents, so that when you are faced with a trade union official or a shop steward, you have precedent, you're able to cite precedent, and you're able to look up, in this instance, this is the frequently asked question, what's the answer? And that's one of the tools we've developed for you. So please have a look at it, give your feedback, because we're really, earnest about wanting to engage with you to give you these kinds of tools on an ongoing basis. Tara, did I answer that question?
It wasn't really a question, but yes, you've covered what the document will be detailing when we send it out to the members. I think it'll probably be easier to send that document and any other relevant documents out when we send the recording from this meeting, as well as the presentation that you've provided. So we'll send them in one email.
Fantastic. Any other questions or comments, colleagues? Okay. So again, I apologize for going 15 minutes over time, but thank you very much for being here and participating with us. And we look forward to our next Human Resource Forum. Please look out on our website under the Human Resource Forum tab for the Labour Bulletin, because that's all current precedent, either coming out from the CCMA or the Bargaining Council or the Labour Court, in terms of how you should think about discipline and the implementation of the Labour Relations Act in your workplace.
Sorry, Ivor, just to
Yes.
confirm, that platform is under construction at the moment. So as soon as it's up and running, we will then inform members that they can obtain the documentation that they're looking for under the various tabs on the website.
Right. It will also mean that once it's finally being constructed, it will mean that we don't have to keep sending out precedents to you, but we'll send you out a monthly update of what is on the Labour bulletin, so that you can actually just go and have a look for yourself. Over time, we'll be able to take a precedent. We'll be able to have the executive extract of the precedent, in other words, the salient judgment or decision, and then the main body of the judgment as well.
Can I just ask you the recording, because I realize a lot more colleagues needed to have listened to your presentation this morning. Where will you make the recording available?
The recording will be made available. The recording of this session will be made available as a link to our YouTube library, so that you can then spread the link and you can share the link. In companies where you've got you're a medium to large size business, if you would like an in-house discussion on the subject, I'm more than happy to organize a Zoom with you on the subject. So again, if there are company specific questions, you can ask those questions.
Thank you.
Good. Aggie, you still awake? All right, guys. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you at the next forum. Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Ivor. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Oh. Who's awake?